All right, so this is our first lecture of Chapter 4, and we're going to look a little bit deeper into fibers, yarns, and textiles. So by the end of this lecture, you will be able to compare and contrast the terms fiber, thread, yarn, and textile, explain how fibers are formed into yarns or rope, distinguish between the warp and weft threads in a woven pattern of a textile, identify and describe common weave patterns of textile samples, and calculate the thread count per square inch of a fabric. So here are a couple of vocabulary terms that you will need to make sure that you're familiar with in order to understand this lecture. Fiber, yarn or thread, textile, warp, weft, and weave pattern. So what is a fiber? Well, fibers are the smallest indivisible units of a textile. They must be at least 100 times longer than they are wide. Fibers can be spun into yarns, which can then be woven, knitted, crocheted, or braided into textiles or fabrics. So here's an image of fiber. I believe this is silk fiber from a silkworm. And this fiber can be spun into a yarn, and yarns usually consist of 2 or more fibers wrapped around each other. And this yarn can then be woven into some type of textile or a fabric. So fibers that are too short in their natural state to be used to make textiles can be spun together to make yarns. Very thin yarns are often called threads. And rope is simply a very thick yarn. Yarns may be spun thick or thin, loose or tight, depending on their use. Some yarns may be a blend of fibers, such as wool and polyester, and this is done to give desired qualities, such as strength or wrinkle resistance. Okay, so what are textiles? Well, fibers can be woven into textiles in their natural state if they are long enough, or once they have been spun into yarns. Weaving consists of arranging lengthwise threads, so this is the warp, side by side and close together. Crosswise threads, the weft, are then pushed back and forth in a specific pattern. So going vertically is going to be the warp, and then horizontally is the weft. The pattern in which the weft passes over and under the warp fibers is called the weave pattern. Okay, so let's look at a couple of common weave patterns. The first one is called plain. So this is just alternating warp and weft threads. And in each of these examples, the warp is going to be the orange threads and the weft are the blue threads. So a plain weave is firm and wears well. It has a low tear strength. It is also snag resistant, but it tends to wrinkle. The basket weave is very similar to the plain weave, but instead it uses 2 warp and 2 weft threads. So this is an alternating pattern of 2 weft threads crossing over 2 warp threads. It is an open or porous weave, and it does not wrinkle. It tends to distort as yarn shifts and shrinks when it is washed. It is not very durable. This third weave is called satin. So this is where one weft crosses over 3 or more warp threads at a time. It's not very durable. It tends to snag and break during wear. It has high light reflectance, which gives it a shiny surface. And it has little friction with other garments. Twill is a weave where the weft is woven over 3 or more warps and then under one. Then in the next row, the pattern is shifted over one to the left or right by one warp thread. It is dense and compact. This makes it very strong. It has different faces, so it looks different on either side of the fabric. And it appears as a diagonal design on the surface, and it is soft and pliable. The lino is much different than any of the other weave patterns we've looked at. So this consists of two adjacent warp threads that cross over each other, while the weft travels left to right and is woven between the two warp threads. It is an open weave and is easily distorted with wear and washing, and it stretches in one direction only. Okay, so now that we know a little bit about the different weave patterns, we can look into how to calculate the thread count. So weave pattern is one way that fibers differ, but is not the only way. The number of threads that are packed together for any given amount of fabric is another characteristic, and this is known as the thread count. So thread count is the number of horizontal weft and vertical warp threads in a square inch of fabric, and is usually written as threads per inch. If the weave is 2-ply or has two threads twisted together, such as in a basket weave, then the thread count is doubled. High quality sheets tend to have higher thread counts of up to 500 threads per inch, and typical sheets have a thread count between 180 and 300 threads per inch. Okay guys, so that wraps up our first lecture of chapter 4, and we'll see you next time for lecture 2.